और सीधे रुख करते हैं लोकसभा पे, जहां पर कराधान संशोधन विधि विधेयक पर वित्त मंत्री अरुण जेटली इस वक्त सरकार की ओर से जवाब दे रहे हैं।
60% that you can charge custom duty up to 60%. The Custom Tariff Act is operated by virtue of exemptions that even though 60 is the maximum, that's the roof, actual applied rate may be only 15% or 20%. That has nothing to do with Income Tax Act, about which you were making a comparison itself. Now, why is it required, this change required in the nature of the marble trade? Currently, we have transient measures like quantitative restrictions, what is the quantity that can come from outside, and we have the minimum import price. The MIP also exists, just as when the global crisis took place recently on steel, and you had a lot of Chinese steel getting into various parts of the world, we have imposed on certain categories of steel a minimum import price. United States, for example, on certain categories of steel went up to 280% anti-dumping duty. So they applied only the anti-dumping tariffs. Now these are various mechanisms which are available. Now the present proposal to raise the roof is that some of these measures which we have taken, whether it is the QRs or it is the MIP, are transient, and there can be a rethink on the duration of these measures. And therefore, if any of these measures is removed, we should not have a situation where a lot of international marble comes in, floods the domestic markets, and the domestic companies are not able to sell their marble itself. And therefore, you are raising the flexibility, creating a new headspace between the 10% presently, which is the bound rate and also the applied rate, and giving it a little flexibility by taking up to 40%. You may not use the entire 40%, but you have the flexibility to prevent a sudden flush of exports getting into the country itself. Now, one of the questions which was raised was, will it raise prices of imported material? Well, if you have to protect the domestic industry, that is one of the instrumentalities available. And those consumers who are rich enough to have deep pockets to use imported marble all of the time, if the prices go up, they can probably afford to pay a little. So Mr. Huda should not be seriously concerned about them. You will have other forms of marble available here itself. The VSNL question, if we look at the nature of the amendment, there is only an example of one company which had this kind of a clause, where as a part of the shareholders' agreement, the land was to be hived off from the disinvested company and put in another company. A large chunk of this land, about 52%, would come to the government of India. How does government get this land, Mr. Premchandran asked? The government gets this land by virtue of its rights under the agreements which were signed in 2002. There is no dispute. How will the land be used? When the land comes to us, it will be parked in a special purpose vehicle, an HPIL, a new government company with a government majority holding which has been created. The land would be parked there. And this land, then the government has the option to use it in many manners. For example, if we are all aware, recently the new Moti Bagh was developed. And this gave more government housing for senior officers. Now you have Kedwai Nagar, Lakshmi Bai Nagar, all these government colonies which are being redeveloped, and a particular redevelopment model is taking place. There is scarcity of government housing in Delhi. Government officers, judges, members of parliament, ministers, all have to wait before they get their housing. Therefore, for government, housing can be one option. Office spaces for government can be another option. Now, depending on the user of the land, once the land vests in a company owned by the government will have a flexibility to use this land in many ways, and a large part of this land is located absolutely in prime areas of South Delhi. And therefore, this will be a great asset which will vest in the government. And the object is to facilitate this transfer, because the transfer, the commercial part of the transaction has taken place. The company was divested 14 years ago. Today, the object is that for 14 years, the government has not taken back its own share of the land. It's a resource being wasted, and therefore the resource must come to the government, and it must come free from any tax liability. That is the objective. There is no change. The company today is only a land-owning company. It has no employees. So it doesn't affect, there is no employees. It's only a land, which is the notional asset of this company. It will vest in a special purpose vehicle which has been created. So it won't have, reservation policy will have no impact as far as this land itself is concerned. A third important issue with regard to garment exports. Why have garment imports shrunk? Or why have imports shrunk? Now, in international trade, the buyer lives outside the country. You sell to foreign countries. And one of the big changes which has taken place in the last 2-3 years is when global trade itself has shrunk. And this shrinkage of global trade is because the countries which buy from us, their economies are adversely impacted. So the buyers today have less money in their pocket. That's the first reality which we must accept. And the world trade shrinking, therefore, is a global phenomena today. There's a second phenomena which is deceptive in the figures that you read. Even where volumes of trade remain the same or have increased, the values of the goods have shrunk. So when metal prices have shrunk, commodity prices have come down, oil prices have come down. Now in the export basket of India, crude oil which comes to India is refined and sent back. Crude oil itself is 18% of our export basket. So if instead of 115 rupees dollars rate, the rate is $45, then this 18% itself is shrinking. The volume will remain the same, but the values will shrink. So a lot of shrinkage is also in values which has taken place. Now, under these circumstances, what members have all agreed that textiles of various forms, whether it is handloom or it is power loom or it is textile apparel for exports, this is an important job creator for India where millions of people are actually employed. Now, last month in July, the cabinet has approved of a complete package as far as the growth of apparel exports and textile industry for domestic use also is concerned in India. And one of the objects is that we give it a boost. Now, Mr. Huda raised a question with some of the other members. I think Professor Bose also raised it. In China, which was a great global supplier of garments, the wages have gone up. And therefore, China is losing that competitive advantage because of the wages that it had. It still has a lot of competitive advantage because there are large volumes in China and very modern factories. Smaller economies, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, these have started doing well. And one of the key reasons why many of them are doing well is that each one of them in international trade has valuation or taxation advantage over India. Bangladesh, for example, has the advantage of being an LDC. So the LDCs have their own quota and their own pricing and taxation regime. So when the world buys from them, they have a price advantage. Even Pakistan, when it exports to Europe, has a price advantage. And therefore, we start with a disadvantage of about 8 to 10%. So in our domestic manufacturing for exports, when we start with a handicap of 8 to 10%, which our neighboring economies have, we have to cover up for that advantage. And therefore, indirectly, unless we are able to incentivize in some manner, we will not be able to compete. And 8 to 10% in pricing gives you a competitive edge itself. Now, this question which has been raised is, if 240 days become 150 days, will employment go down? The reality is that Indian garments, which are manufactured apparel for export, we can visit any of our export units, are all summer garments. Lazy skirts, blouses, western dresses and so on. We are not a great exporter of woolen garments. And therefore the nature of this trade itself is seasonal. Pardon? No, it's not there. It is not there. It's not there. It's not there. And therefore, if we are to cover up for this tax disadvantage or handicap that Indian exports have compared to LDCs and other neighboring competitors, we have to give our companies some kind of a tax advantage. And the whole object is that because it is seasonal in nature, if you are to expect them to reach 240 days to get that employment incentive, they are not able to raise, so it's only an incentive which we have given on paper. In other industries where there is job 365 days a year, they can avail of it. But in apparel, they are not able to avail of it. And that is why this additional advantage is intended to be given, so that, and Professor Bose was right when he said that mostly are women. 70 to 80% of the people employed in this industry are women. And therefore, if we go particularly in Karnataka, which is very advanced, in Gurgaon it's very advanced, it's women, and the nature of the industry is such that this tax advantage is intended to be given to them, so that the apparel industry also becomes competitive, so that they are able to make the cost advantage itself. And I'm sure with these incentives, the apparel industry would be able to contribute a large number of jobs. That's all I said. With these few observations, sir, I commend this bill for the acceptance of the House.
The question is that the bill be taken to consideration. Those in favor may say aye. Those against may say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion for consideration of the bill is adopted. The House will now take up class by class consideration of the bill. Sri Adil Chaudhary, are you moving amendment number 1? Are moving.
Finance Minister Arun Jaitley was responding to a discussion in Lok Sabha on Taxation Laws Amendment Bill 2016. The Finance Minister said that there are least developing countries that have an advantage as far as trading in clothes is concerned. He said that that does not apply to India, which has a pricing disadvantage compared to the LDCs like Bangladesh of 8 to 9%. Thus, we need to incentivize our textiles sector to make up for that disadvantage. He said that Indian garments are predominantly exported during the summer because they are summer garments that are exported, not so much winter garments. So this trade is seasonal in nature. If we have to make up for that handicap, we need to give our companies tax advantage. He also referred to the comprehensive package that the government announced for the textile sector recently. So those were some of the highlights of Finance Minister Arun Jaitley's address to the Lok Sabha while responding to a discussion on Taxation Laws Amendment Bill 2016. Let's